One by one, prostitutes die across Central Europe. Austrian authorities believe one man is responsible. But they have no experience hunting serial killers. They turn to an FBI profiler for help. He finds the same killer has come to America, and the death count keeps rising until the FBI stops him.
Beginning in 1990, Europe found itself in the clutches of a serial killer. He became an international outlaw, hopping from country to country to evade capture and to kill again. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Legal cooperation between countries and continents is not common, but neither are serial killers in Europe. Desperate to apprehend him, Austrian authorities called on the FBI for help.
In Austria, the exchange of sex for money has been legal for years. Here, prostitutes walk the streets for men willing to pay for their services. Throughout most of the 1980s, Heidemarie Hammerer worked in the city of Bregenz as a prostitute. A licensed professional for almost 10 years. She was used to unusual requests. But on the night of December 5th, 1990, a customer went too far. The killer hurriedly redressed his victim. Then he dragged her through a secluded forest some 10 miles away and left her body. The crime went undiscovered for 3 weeks. On the morning of New Year's Eve, 1990, a pair of hikers stumbled upon Hammerer's body. Though the body had been left exposed to the elements, the winter temperatures helped preserve the remains. Austrian authorities determined that Hammerer had been strangled with her own pantyhose. Her wrists were bruised from restraints. At the autopsy, they found no sexual discharge on her body. But they did find fibers that were inconsistent with her clothing. She was only the first victim. Over the next several months, 3 more prostitutes died violently throughout Austria. Brunhilde Masser was recovered in a stream bed near Graz. Elfriede Schrempf, also from Graz, was found nearby in the woods. Near Vienna, Sylvia Zagler was discovered in a stand of trees. The women had all been bruised, strangled with their pantyhose, and left in various states of undress, lying face down in wooded areas. The Austrian public was shocked. On April 4th, 1991, the authorities gathered their most experienced investigators to focus on the slayings. Because of the similarities in the 4 cases, investigators reasoned that one person was responsible. Austria had its first serial killer in modern history. They had no experience investigating these offenders. Dr. Ernst Geiger, one of Austria's leading detectives, was assigned to coordinate the hunt.
No lead was promising. All the leads ended nowhere. We had no real suspect.
The first break came when a retired policeman read of the murders in a Salzburg newspaper. They reminded him of a case he solved in 1974. Detective Geiger received a phone call from the retired officer. 15 years earlier, he told Geiger, a young woman had been strangled with one of her undergarments and dumped in the woods. Just like the present victims. The killer was caught and convicted, but had recently been paroled. Detective Geiger took the name of the ex-convict, Johann Jack Unterweger.
Jack Unterweger was paroled after 15 years because he had murdered a young girl before, and while he was in prison, he became a writer, quite a famous writer.
But was it possible that this famous writer could be a serial killer? Geiger and his team began looking into the journalist's background. Until 1990, Jack Unterweger had led a difficult life. He was born to a German prostitute who quickly abandoned him. He suffered neglect and abuse, shuttling between various foster situations. As a teenager, Jack began to play out the rage of his dismal childhood. By age 25, that fury earned Unterweger a life sentence. Unterweger continued his education and started writing while in prison. He published letters, plays, short stories, and an autobiography. In the book that became a bestseller, Unterweger painted a tragic tale of himself as victim. Critics and the public alike embraced the author for the apparent honesty with which he confronted his past. The literary community suggested that art had redeemed him. Eventually, the press and the public at large demanded that his life sentence be commuted. On May 12, 1990, Austrian authorities agreed. The 40-year-old Austrian walked out of prison. He was a free man, determined never to spend another minute of his life behind bars. Shortly after his release, he was hired by a major German magazine to cover the prostitute murders. He promised to use his writing in a socially conscious way. He told his editor that he wanted to give voice to the dispossessed, caught in the underbelly of society, as he once was. By July 1991, after 2 more prostitutes were found strangled, psychologist Tom Mueller of Austria's Criminal Investigation Division joined the team.
When we started the investigation against Jack Unterweger, it was pretty hard because all his friends were within the media and they couldn't understand that he could be the bad guy.
Even among investigators, only a handful considered this celebrity journalist a possible suspect. Through receipts and travel records, Geiger and Mueller learned that Unterweger had been at each murder location. This was not suspicious in itself, since he was covering the story as an investigative journalist. Yet he always reached those destinations before the murders took place. Investigators also discovered that Unterweger had visited Prague in September 1990, just before a Czechoslovakian woman, Blanka Bokova, was strangled with her pantyhose. She was the earliest victim in the string of murders that now totaled 7.
And what was outstanding for us, that exactly at any time where Czech hang out at any place in Prague, in the western part of Austria, in the southern part of Austria, exactly in that time period there was always a dead body somewhere in the woods.
In Austria, another woman, Regina Prem, had been missing for months and presumed dead. Her family waited desperately for news of her fate. In October of 1991, the grief-stricken husband and son received a chilling phone call to their unlisted number. The caller told him that he was Regina's killer and described what she was wearing the night she disappeared. The caller claimed that he was the executioner, that God ordered him to do it, that she was left lying on the place of sacrifice with her face turned towards hell. The phone call was cruel torture to an already traumatized family. When police recovered her body, they confirmed Regina Prem was the killer's 8th victim to date. The discovery put them no closer to stopping the killer. Vienna, October 22, 1991. Austrian authorities questioned Unterweger for the first time. With no hard evidence to connect him to the crimes, they hoped for a confession. He admitted to consorting with prostitutes for his writing assignments and for sex. But he denied knowing the victims. Although his alibis were weak, investigators were forced to release him. Their evidence was merely circumstantial, and his public support was growing. But Mueller and Geiger still believed Unterweger was a strong suspect and continued digging into his past. They tracked down the car Jack drove when he was first released from prison. But it had been a year since he sold it, and the likelihood of finding any usable evidence was slim. The team uncovered little, except a hair fragment.
It's good. It's good.
Although it was a long shot, investigators sent the hair fragment to the University of Bern for analysis. Enough of the hair root remained for lab technicians to extract a DNA sequence. That sequence was compared to those of the victims. Of the 8 women slain, the DNA from the hair matched the earliest victim from Prague, Blanka Bokova, killed in September 1990. It was a breakthrough. But that only proved the woman was in the car when Jack owned it. Investigators needed stronger evidence. Now back at police headquarters, Geiger questioned Austrian prostitutes. They recognized Unterweger as a regular customer who insisted they wear handcuffs during sex. More importantly, one recalled seeing him approach her friend, Heide Marie Hammerer, the first victim discovered in Bregenz. She also remembered he wore a brown leather jacket on that night. On the strength of this identification and the hair fragment found in his car, Geiger obtained a warrant to search Unterweger's apartment.
Jack, Unterweger? Polizei!
When the police arrived, Unterweger was nowhere to be found. They took away clothing, including a brown leather jacket for forensic examination. Then one of the detectives discovered some receipts in a trash can. They were from a seafood restaurant in Malibu, California, dated 9 months earlier. Jack Unterweger had been to the United States. But the apartment search yielded less than the investigators had hoped. They found no hard evidence that directly tied Unterweger to the slayings. Since their case was still too weak to issue an arrest warrant, the investigation stalled. Jack Unterweger was still one step ahead. To stop him, Geiger needed help from those more experienced with catching serial killers. He needed the FBI. The Austrian investigators visited the U.S. Embassy. They met with legal attaché Julianne Slisko, an FBI agent stationed in Vienna.
Hoping you could help us with the FBI.
Slisko called the criminal profiling unit in Quantico, Virginia.
Hi, Agent McCrary. Serial
She was patched
killer.
through to Special Agent Greg
Done
McCrary.
some killings here in Austria.
Now retired, McCrary spent the last 10 of his 25 years in the FBI, pioneering the science of profiling.
The Austrians contacted the FBI because they were trying to tap into our experience of dealing with serial homicide investigations. This was the first serial murder investigation in modern history in Austria.
McCrary agreed to assist the Austrians. He would help them determine if one perpetrator could have committed all the murders. When Geiger told Slisko that Unterweger had traveled to LA the previous summer, she authorized a telex to be sent to California to inform local authorities. Over the next several days, Geiger and Mueller prepared for their trip to the FBI, packing crime scene reports, autopsy protocols, and photos. Then they received a call from LA detective Fred Miller. Miller had received their telex and said that California had suffered a similar pattern of killings during the prior summer. Now investigators turned their attention to LA, 6,000 miles away, in the hunt for the Austrian serial killer. By the fall of 1991, 8 women had been found dead in Central Europe. The prime suspect was Austrian celebrity writer Jack Unterweger. But little forensic evidence tied him to the crimes. And the public believed the police were pursuing an innocent man. An FBI telex from Vienna to California caught the attention of Los Angeles detective Fred Miller. He and his partner, Jim Harper, had been working for months on a series of unsolved murders. In style and pattern, the LA crimes resembled the ones that Unterweger was suspected of in Austria.
This immediately lit the fires, and it was just unbelievable to go all these 8 months and without the suspect turning up or another murder. This was quite a boost to the investigation.
The American and Austrian investigators compared notes. The cases were clearly similar. The victims were prostitutes. All had been strangled using intimate apparel, and all the bodies were left in remote locations. Now, Miller and Harper began to reconstruct Unterweger's visit to California. They checked the airlines, car rental agencies, and hotel logs. From these, they created a timeline of his movements.
We learned that he came to Los Angeles in June of '91 on vacation, right around June the 2nd or 3rd, and that he left around the 17th of July.
In the summer of 1990, Unterweger visited LAPD headquarters.
And I'm a journalist, and I am interested.
He strolled into the public relations office, presented his press credentials, and signed up for the Ride-Along program.
And the Austrian police.
This program allows civilians to tag along with police in their cruisers as they patrol the city.
Tonight at 8:30
As all Jack's credentials were in order, the request was accepted.
It's Jack Unterweger.
Unterweger claimed he was writing a German magazine story, contrasting American and European prostitution. He asked to be shown where the city's prostitutes hung out. The officers introduced him to the seedier areas of Los Angeles. Detective Jim Harper explains.
I mean, if you come to a city as big as Los Angeles, you know, prostitutes don't hang out everywhere. You gotta know where they hang out. What better way to do that than get a ride along with the police department?
Witnesses last saw 21-year-old Shannon Exley in the vicinity of 7th Street and Main Street.
What's that you saying?
She had been working the streets since she'd run away from home at 16. Her life ended on June 20th, 1991. Her nude body was found with her bra wrapped around her neck. Marks on her feet told investigators she had already been strangled when she was dragged some 50 feet to where she was found.
Lacerations across her neck.
Medical technicians were able to isolate DNA sequences from the semen of 7 men. But LA detectives had no suspects with whom they could compare the samples. 10 days later, investigators discovered a second prostitute, Irene Rodriguez. She was found behind a tractor trailer, only a mile and a half from where Exley's body had been dumped. Both women had been strangled with their bras, and both were last seen in the vicinity of 7th and Main Street. The detectives discovered that Unterweger was living nearby.
We learned that he stayed at the Cecil Hotel, which is located at 643 South Main, which is right on the corner of 7th and Main Street, and that's the location where, close proximity where both our victims were last seen.
A third victim, Sherry Long, was found near Malibu less than 2 weeks later. Once again, Unterweger was staying at a hotel in the vicinity Long was last seen. Around her neck, her bra was tied tightly. Detective Jim Harper remembers the unique method of strangulation.
The way the bras were tied around their neck was nothing that I had seen before. It looks to me it took a lot of intricate time to really take time with the victim and put it around their necks and tie it.
Los Angeles criminalist Lynn Harold compared the knots to see if there was a pattern in the way each had been made and tied.
In order for the knots to be made, the wearing apparel had to be dismantled in some form. It's not like the bras were just taken and tied in a square knot, but they were stripped of the elastic, always on the left side. And if 3 people randomly went out and strangled 3 people, it is extremely unlikely that all 3 of them would come up with this same scenario.
Now Geiger and Mueller added the information from the Los Angeles murders to their own case and headed to Virginia. They hoped that the FBI could determine whether one man had indeed killed all 11 women. Back in Austria, Jack Unterweger maintained a high profile. The celebrity journalist continued to publish his articles and appeared on television to talk about the murders. He told audiences that the Austrian police were inept at finding the real killer and had singled him out as a scapegoat. Unterweger claimed that the authorities were determined to send him back to prison, even if that meant framing him for the grisly crimes. Unterweger remained popular with the public at large and in the nightclubs where he was a regular. To his fans, and especially women, he was still charming. He boasted the police had no evidence, only theories. And they would never be able to send him back to prison. In August 1992, Austrian detectives arrived at Quantico, Virginia. They needed an experienced FBI profiler to help them capture the serial killer that had left 11 women dead in Central Europe and California. The Austrians came with 12 boxes of evidence.
Report on that.
Special Agent Greg McCrary refused to look at any information on the prime suspect, Jack Unterweger. He didn't want any preconceived notions to interfere with his analysis. Instead, McCrary wanted to focus on the victims.
I wanted all the case materials on all of the homicides, victimology, a lot about the victims and their background, their history, the method and manner of death, autopsy reports, crime scene photos, everything that was available from an investigative point of view. What we didn't want is suspect information. We just wanted to take an objective look at all of the cases to see what we thought, if they might be related or not, and the type of offender that we thought might be most probably involved in committing these crimes.
Let's get to work.
McCrary did not presuppose that the crimes were linked. He examined the similarities among the cases to see if they were unusual enough to have been committed by one perpetrator. He began to look for a behavioral thumbprint, a criminal signature in each of the murders.
A signature crime analysis is an assessment of the behavioral aspects of the crime, which can in some cases be a single event, but more often it's a constellation of behaviors that are consistent from crime to crime to crime. And this allows us to link crimes together behaviorally based on the behavior of the offender.
Could you push this one back? Yes. Finish. Yes.
McCrary looked for patterns. He examined everything known about the 11 women. How similar were their lifestyles? Almost all the women were prostitutes, except for the first woman slain in Prague.
Mr. McCrary, this is a map of Vienna.
A companion last saw Blanka Bokova on September 14, 1990, leaving a bar in Prague, Czechoslovakia. Bokova worked as a sales clerk at a butcher shop, but was known to trade sex for favors. Her body was left on the bank of the Vlatva River in a stretch of woods near Bokova's home. The killer had strangled her with her own nylon stockings. He left her naked, covered with sticks and twigs. He threw her clothes and identification in the river. The first victim Austrian police found had been a registered prostitute for 10 years, Heide Marie Hammerer. In the early part of her career, she had suffered several violent attacks from customers, so she was known to be cautious. Hammerer was last seen outside a parking garage on December 5, 1990. Like the first 5 victims, Hammerer was found in the woods close to water. They all had restraint bruises on their arms and wrists. And autopsies found no semen on any of the European victims. To the profiler, this suggested that the killer struck out of impotence. He was terribly insecure about his masculinity. When he could not perform after being sexually stimulated, the killer lashed out in anger. He strangled the women he blamed for shaming him. Then he left their bodies in humiliating positions. Next, they focused on the LA murder victims. Did they fit the pattern that had been established in Europe? Shannon Exley was found face down in a grassy area near a freeway exit. She was nude, except for a t-shirt and a pair of socks. She had been dragged 50 feet from the pavement to the location where she was discovered, after being strangled with her brassiere. Again, this crime, like the others in LA and Europe, showed the killer had preferences and that the violence itself had become erotic to him.
It became clear that there was a pattern to these homicides. That there was sort of a ritualistic behavior that occurred in each of these crime scenes. Each woman was similar in nature, either a prostitute or a woman who traded sex for favors. They were on the street when they were contacted, when they were picked up, usually very surreptitiously. No one really saw these women get into a car. They were transported out to an area, they were murdered, ligature or strangled with an article of their own clothing, disposed in a similar manner in an outdoor setting, absence of sexual assault.
All right, roughly from where she was last seen.
After a week, the study of the victimology convinced McCrary that there had indeed been only one killer behind the 11 homicides. The FBI agent and the Austrian detective spent the following week drawing up a profile of the assailant.
Last seen here. Is that she in
The evidence suggested the killer had a good degree of mobility. He was older, intelligent, sophisticated, and an organized offender. To criminal psychologist Tom Mueller, this described Jack Unterweger.
I would say Jack was a very, very good example for a typical type of organized offender, and I would say he was a typical example for a natural psychologist. He was able to understand the needs of other people. He was able to come close to other people, to listen to other people, and then to manipulate them.
But the geography worked against the theory that there was one killer. The murders had occurred in Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Los Angeles. With minor exceptions, most serial killers stay regional and prey within a comfort zone. But enough time had elapsed between the slayings to permit one culprit to move around. Now the profiler compared Unterweger's travels to the chronology of the murders.
And when I overlaid Jack Unterweger's timeline on the timeline of the crimes, they fit perfectly. And that was really a dawning moment, the aha moment, the moment that's really exciting in analysis like this, because now you have a suspect whose movements correlate perfectly with each of the homicides, as well as his prior homicide that he had been convicted for, bearing a lot of similarities to these homicides. We can put him in each place at each time these crimes occurred. And either Jack Unterweger was the unluckiest man in the world to have been there, or he was an excellent suspect.
In Austria, Unterweger continued to enjoy his freedom and notoriety. Some women still found him appealing, even though the former convict was a prime murder suspect. This perplexed Detective Fred Miller.
One of the interesting facets of Jack Unterweger was that he could carry on a normal relationship with a female and still be this cruel and murder other females.
High school student Bianca Mrak was one of those that fell under his charm. The impressionable 18-year-old met Unterweger in a wine bar where she worked as a waitress. She was flattered by the attention from the celebrity writer. He told her he was tiring of all the publicity in Austria and might leave the country, maybe to Switzerland. She agreed to go with him wherever he went. August 1992, Agent Greg McCrary of the FBI worked with Austrian detectives to solve a series of 11 murders. 8 women were killed in Central Europe, 3 more in Los Angeles. All circumstantial evidence pointed to celebrity journalist Jack Unterweger as the culprit. Then they received a phone call from the University of Bern. Austrian lab technicians had completed the fiber analysis of clothing confiscated from Unterweger's apartment weeks before. The inspection had yielded results. Fibers from the lining of the brown leather jacket matched those on the body of Heide Marie Hammerer, the first prostitute found. It was hard forensic evidence that tied Unterweger to one of the victims. But investigators wanted to conclusively link the suspect to all the victims. The FBI had another tool that could do just that, VICAP, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. The computer database holds the details of 10,000 solved and unsolved U.S. homicides. A programmer inputted the particulars of the European and Los Angeles cases. Details of the victims, their manner of death, locations where they disappeared, and where they were found were all fed into the computer. McCrary ordered an extensive breakdown, a multi-dimensional search with 15 cross-criteria that could show if the crimes were connected.
I certainly will, Mr. McCrary.
48 hours later, the detectives were called back to the VICAP room to hear the answer. The results were stunning. The computer statistically linked all 11 slayings. Jack Unterweger was the killer. The FBI had given the Austrians solid proof for their case. But Unterweger was still at large. The Austrian detectives immediately returned to Vienna. Armed with the FBI profile, authorities issued an arrest warrant for Johann Jack Unterweger. Again, the police descended upon the writer's residence. But Jack was gone. He had abandoned his flat. Geiger called his office and ordered his team to check all of Austria's ports of exit. Within hours, all train stations and airports were canvassed. But they found no sign of Unterweger. The serial killer was gone. Unterweger had already fled with Bianca Marak beyond the reach of Austrian authorities.
Jack Unterweger is a very good representative of an intelligent psychopath. He became an award-winning author and playwright, but psychopaths are very, very manipulative, and they have a supreme ability to con other people.
Hello? Hello? Yeah. Yeah, ich bin here.
On a stop in Paris, Jack called into television shows and protested his innocence. He said his flight was not an admission of guilt, but an attempt to evade a frame-up by the police. He promised to return to Austria and answer all questions if the arrest warrant was withdrawn. Despite his media appearances, the Austrian police had no idea where Unterweger was hiding. In Vienna, investigators interviewed Unterweger's friends. They were unfazed by the fact that he had been indicted for multiple murders. They said that Jack had run off for a holiday in America with Bianca Marak, a former waitress from the wine bar. Bianca was known to live with her mother, so Geiger paid a visit to Mrs. Marak. She acknowledged that she had been in contact with the fugitive couple, sending them money via wire transfers. They were in New York and heading down to Florida. Geiger told her to contact him if her daughter called again. Mrs. Marak agreed. Just days later, she got a call from Miami. Her daughter needed more money. Mrs. Marak promptly informed the Austrian police. U.S. Marshals were waiting at the Western Union. The Marshals ID'd the couple as they drove up.
U.S. Marshals, you're under arrest! U.S. Marshals, you're under arrest!
Unterweger was quickly apprehended.
It's not right.
He was jailed in Miami to await extradition. Both the nation of Austria and the state of California wanted to prosecute him. LAPD Detective Fred Miller began conferring with his Austrian counterparts.
After Jack's arrest in Miami, we dealt almost on a daily schedule with the Austrian authorities, trying to put the information they had on their murders together with the information on the California murders. The Austrian authorities made trips to Los Angeles. They provided us with whatever materials we needed, photographs of the crime scenes, information on their victims, information on Jack.
The Austrians wanted to prosecute Unterweger in their court for all 11 murders. But they knew that would be difficult. The Austrian public perceived Jack as a celebrity. Detectives would have to convince them that Jack's private evil side was the reality. Special Agent Greg McCrary explains.
What's interesting with Jack, if you look at different pictures from different parts of his life, many times he's nattily attired with a bow tie and has this almost young, innocent-looking face. But then if you see him with his shirt off and you look at these really diabolical, involved prison tattoos that are typical of the more violent psychopathic offenders you have in prison, you see the dichotomy between Jack's outward appearance and the inner psychopathology becomes more apparent.
Always try to get
The LAPD detectives obtained a search warrant for tissue samples from the prisoner. In Miami, a technician drew blood, took hair samples and swabs of saliva for DNA testing. The samples were sent back to a Los Angeles lab for analysis. His DNA matched that found in the semen from Shannon Exley. But Exley's body contained semen from 6 other men. And there was no sexual discharge found in the other 2 LA prostitutes. Jack Unterweger worried that he would be transferred to California, where a death penalty was possible. He did not want to die in the gas chamber. But if he went back to Austria, he could be tried for the crimes on both continents. Criminal psychologist Tom Mueller explains.
If an Austrian citizen is committing a crime wherever in the world, the Austrian law is responsible for that guy. So the American authorities gave the clearance to bring Mr. Unterweger here back to Austria.
But Unterweger could delay this by fighting extradition. LA detectives pressured him. They assured Unterweger that he would be found guilty in California and reminded him of the state's death penalty. Fearing the gas chamber, he agreed to deportation.
You'll sign the extradition.
Despite the evidence, he still enjoyed popular support at home. And Unterweger believed he could persuade a jury that the authorities were wrong. But the Austrians were betting on the FBI profile. When Jack Unterweger returned to his native Austria, he faced 11 counts of murder. 7 women were killed on Austrian soil, but the laws of the Central European country allow its citizens to be tried for crimes committed anywhere in the world. The murder indictment had done little to diminish the writer's support in the media. As he sat in jail awaiting trial, Jack continued to lobby the press that the police had framed him. His case saturated the news. In this highly charged environment, Austrian prosecutors prepared for trial. If they wanted to win, they had to present an airtight case. LAPD detective Jim Harper journeyed to Vienna for the trial.
The OJ case here in LA is the only thing I can kind of equate it to. It was that big over there. It was all over the newspapers, headlines. I mean, and when we came into this town to testify, it was a big deal. We were all over the front page of the paper, the whole deal.
The trial was held before a 3-judge tribunal. The prosecution argued their case with minimal physical evidence. They were counting on Agent McCrary's behavioral profile.
Could you say why there's so many different places?
So it became increasingly important to link these crimes together behaviorally. That really was the only way that Jack could be linked to this entire series of crimes. So that became the critical component in the prosecution of Jack, and where we were most able to assist the Austrian authorities.
Take them to a different spot.
McCrary related to the judges what he had deducted at Quantico. The killer always chose prostitutes, or those who traded sex for favors. He was criminally sophisticated, older, at least in his late 30s. He wasn't panicky nor disorganized. He possessed inner rage, but it was very controlled. The victims had bruises on their wrists as if they had been restrained with handcuffs. McCrary was convinced Unterweger would ask the prostitutes to wear them to fulfill his sexual fantasy. But it was about control. The killer wanted their hands secured to prevent them from resisting.
The bodies were found
McCrary's testimony linked the victims together.
to where they were laid.
Across 2 continents, the trail of deaths followed Jack Unterweger. Where he went, women died. While he visited Los Angeles, 3 prostitutes were murdered, and their slayings mimicked those in Europe. Shannon Exley and the other 2 American women were strangled to death. The offender used their brassieres as ligatures. And Unterweger tied the knots on the ligatures in exactly the same way as he had on the ones in Europe. McCrary pointed out that the probability was infinitesimal that more than one killer committed the crimes.
What are the chances that more than one offender would be not only choosing to ligature strangle a victim with an article of her own clothing, but he would tie the knots in exactly the same way? Very, very remote chance that we've had different offenders committing the crime in that manner.
But the defense argued there was a difference. The victims in Los Angeles had been strangled with their brassieres, and women in Europe had been strangled with their pantyhose. But McCrary countered that European prostitutes do not wear brassieres. What mattered to the killer was that he used an intimate article of the victim's clothing.
The prostitutes, I'm sure that he was much more hurried.
LA criminalist Lynn Harold was asked to compare the knots from the pantyhose to those from the bras.
In the case of the pantyhose, you had one leg. The second leg was double backed on itself and used as the third segment for the weaving or braiding, in a manner extremely similar to one of the bra cases where the 2 pieces of elastic formed 2 segments and the left strap was pulled through as the third braid.
In all, the trial lasted 2.5 months. On June 28, 1994, a jury in Graz, Austria, found Johann Jack Unterweger guilty of 9 of the murders. The remaining victims were found too badly decomposed to convict Unterweger beyond a reasonable doubt. The verdict meant life in prison to a man who swore he would never spend another day behind bars. And he never did. Unterweger strangled himself with a nylon cord stripped from his uniform.
We normally think of suicide as coming from depression or someone who feels shame or guilt or remorseful in some way. This is not at all what was going on when Jack committed suicide. More psychopathic offenders like Jack do it to exert control, and it's the last great defiant act that he exercised to wrest control of this situation away from the government, away from the authorities. He would not allow himself to be imprisoned for the rest of his life.
Jack Unterweger proved that serial killers are not just an American phenomenon. European law enforcement agencies realized that to fight criminals of this sort, they would have to follow the FBI's example.
What we learned out of their case was that in Austria and even in Europe, we didn't have a similar system like VICAP. Violent Crime Apprehension Program. The Criminal Psychology Service tried to get a similar system here to Austria, and therefore we can work with all sex crime cases and homicide cases.
Now, thanks to the lead of the FBI, many countries have adopted profiling and a computerized criminal database, in the hopes that open borders and conflicting jurisdictions will no longer allow these predators to escape justice. In the fall of 1995, a serial killer was on the loose. Crossing the country, he lured women with his charm and then struck. Each time, he vanished before police could catch him. The FBI and police detectives needed to stop him before another victim met this deadly stranger.
The body of a young woman found burned in a truck launched a manhunt to find her killer. When more bodies began to turn up across the country, the FBI believed the cases were linked. Investigators had a suspect. They just couldn't find him. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Agents would enlist the help of local law enforcement and even long-haul truckers to stop a cross-country killer.
In the early morning hours of September 29, 1995, the Los Angeles Fire Department responded to a vehicle fire at a hospital in Van Nuys. They found a pickup truck burning in the parking lot. When the flames were extinguished, they found human remains. Firemen contacted the Arson and Homicide Division of the Los Angeles Police Department. Homicide detectives responded to the scene and were briefed by uniformed officers already there. They questioned a witness, a nurse who had seen the fire start. She said she had arrived for work before dawn for the early morning shift. In the parking lot, she saw the truck go ablaze. She saw the outline of a figure with long hair run from the truck as the flames erupted. She never saw a face. And she had never seen the truck before. Investigators inspected the vehicle. The pattern of fire damage indicated it had begun in the cab and had burned very quickly. Investigators believed it had been intentionally set. An accelerant had been used, probably gasoline. The body inside appeared to be a female, but it was burned beyond recognition. Some items survived the fire, including a backpack, a camera, and a roll of undeveloped film. Technicians recovered several documents that bore the name Sandra Gallagher. By sunrise, detectives at LAPD's Van Nuys station had run the truck's plates.
Okay, I'll call back.
Through DMV records, Detective Mike Koblenz was able to confirm that Sandra Gallagher owned the truck.
We'd done some work at the office and learned that she was in fact married to an individual, Steve, who lived in the Los Angeles area. We attempted to contact him and made arrangements to interview him at Van Nuys Station.
Detectives suspected it was Sandra in the truck, but identification through dental records would take a few days.
I have some things I'd like you to look at. See if you can tell me if they recognize.
Since the body was too damaged to identify, detectives asked Stephen Gallagher to look through the recovered evidence. He said the backpack, camera, and other items were Sandra's. The police department had developed a roll of film that survived the fire. Stephen identified his wife in the pictures. Most married homicide victims are killed by their husbands.
We were having a few problems. But
Detectives asked Stephen about his relationship with Sandra.
There's a lot of domestic violence, spousal abuse that goes on, so it's just a direction to go to initially. In our case, as it related to Sandra Gallagher, once again, we wanted to eliminate the husband as a suspect and determine a little bit more about our victim, Sandra.
Stephen said he had seen his wife on September 28th, the day before the truck fire.
Exciting's been happening. What about you?
60 hours.
That day, the couple had met for lunch.
My brother may be getting a promotion. He's gonna get
He
a
and
promotion.
Sandra were experiencing marital problems, and they had spent the last couple of nights apart.
He should know, I would say, week after next.
They had talked about reconciling,
Who was that guy I saw at the bar with the other night? Big guy in the leather jacket?
but things were still strained between them.
That's none of your business, okay?
Stephen told detectives he last saw Sandra around 2 p.m., though he heard from his wife later that evening.
We split apart for a bit. Still trying to work.
He said Sandra called him from a local bar called McRed's.
I know.
She was very excited and told him she had won $1,200 in the lottery.
I was over my brother's.
Since that call, Stephen hadn't heard from his wife and had no idea where she had gone.
There were a few other people.
Detectives had to corroborate his story.
Once he mentioned the bar McRed's, that was our direction. We wanted to get in there, find out who was the bartender, who the owner was, who was there that particular evening, and who could identify some photos of Sandra that we'd gathered from the truck.
LAPD detectives visited the bar. When shown a photo of Sandra Gallagher, the bartender recognized the woman.
Okay. What can you tell me about her?
She knew her by her nickname,
She
Sam.
had a lottery ticket. Hey. Guess what?
The bartender confirmed that Sandra had been in the bar on the night of the 28th. She had told everyone about her lottery win.
Yeah.
Some customers overheard the detective's questions and said they had also been in McRed's that
Can
evening.
you tell me about her when she was in here the other night?
They also remembered Sandra and recalled one man who talked with her that night.
These people in the bar had mentioned to us that they recognized the photographs and they identified the photographs as a female by the name of Sam. This is the name that they knew her by, was Sam. And everybody had mentioned she was with a person by the name of Glenn.
Yeah.
They described Glenn as having long blonde hair and a beard. He'd been coming in regularly for the past few days. That night, he seemed interested in Sandra and talked to her for quite a while.
Okay.
Glenn was friendly and came across as a big spender, buying drinks for Sandra and the others. When the bar closed, Glenn had asked Sandra for a ride home. He said he lived nearby. She agreed to drop him off, and they left together. The customers hadn't seen Glenn since that night.
Yeah, she took him home.
Do you know where he lives?
It was about 5 minutes.
They believed Glenn's last name was Rogers, but they weren't sure. Their description of him matched the one of the man seen fleeing the burning truck.
If you think of anything else, please call me.
Detective Koblenz would check the lead.
For your help. Thank you.
Through department sources, we were able to identify Glenn Rogers as a resident in the Van Nuys area. And we were able to obtain photographs of Mr. Rogers. These photographs in the next day or two were shown to various witnesses at the bar in the form of a photo lineup. And Mr. Rogers was identified in this photo lineup as the person being at McRed's with Sandra Gallagher.
detectives secured a search warrant for Rogers' apartment. It was only a few minutes away from where the truck had been burned.
LAPD, search warrant.
They didn't know if Rogers was inside, perhaps with a weapon. Uniformed officers entered first to clear the apartment. Rogers wasn't there. It looked like Rogers had cleared out in a hurry. Detectives recovered a purse and a woman's wallet. It was empty of cash and held no ID.
No identification.
They also found a woman's earring.
The earring became significant in that her husband, Steve Gallagher, identified that earring as one that he had purchased as a pair for his wife a couple months earlier.
After several days, the coroner made his report. He positively identified the remains from the truck as those of Sandra Gallagher. He determined that she had not burned to death.
We learn in the nose area of our victim there wasn't any presence of evidence of fire, sooting, and so on. That gave us information that because she didn't breathe any of the fire, any of the soot, it gave us an indication that she had died prior to the fire itself.
The mother of three had been killed by manual strangulation. Los Angeles detectives charged Glenn Rogers with Sandra Gallagher's murder and issued a warrant for his arrest. They entered Rogers' name and description into the NCIC, the National Crime Information Center, a database that links over 57,000 law enforcement agencies nationwide.
That informs other agencies around the United States that Glenn Rogers, in this case, is in fact wanted in Los Angeles for murder. It would list the agency, Los Angeles Police Department, Van Nuys area, with my name and my phone number. If they have any contact with Glenn Rogers and happen to run him, this warrant would show up in their jurisdiction and he'd be taken into custody.
Detectives sought out anyone who knew Glenn Rogers. They learned he frequented local bars and worked odd jobs, mostly in construction. They visited several job sites, interviewing his friends and co-workers.
Through witnesses and friends, we learned that Glenn did have a temper, and that when he drank, he did become enraged. There was domestic violence involved with former girlfriends. So we knew we were dealing with someone who could become violent, and generally violent when he drank, as it was in our case with Sandra Gallagher.
One of his friends said he hadn't seen Rogers in a while, but promised to contact the police if he heard from him.
Okay.
A few days later, Rogers' friend called. He said Rogers had phoned him from a motel outside Jackson, Mississippi. Local police talked to the motel manager, who told them Rogers' room number.
Police, open up!
The room was empty. The murder suspect was on the run. In the fall of 1995, the search continued for Glenn Rogers. Police believed he fled California after killing a woman there on September 28th. A tip led to a Mississippi motel, but Rogers had disappeared before police arrived. Police issued an APB locally. They hoped someone would spot the suspected killer before he left the area. Days later, on November 3rd, 1995, Jackson, Mississippi detectives responded to a murder. Family members had found Linda Price dead in her bathtub. The 34-year-old single mother had been stabbed repeatedly and her throat had been slashed. Investigators searched the apartment for evidence. Technicians photographed the scene and lifted numerous latent fingerprints. They found no murder weapon. No valuables seemed to be missing. There was no apparent forced entry, and the killer had locked the door when leaving. The details of the crime scene led Jackson homicide detectives to conclude Linda Price had been killed by someone she knew. In the morning, they interviewed her mother. Perhaps she knew the killer as well. She said her daughter had a new boyfriend. His name was Glenn Rogers. A month earlier, on October 3rd, Linda had met Rogers at the Mississippi State Fair where he had been working. He was charming, and Linda fell for him right away.
That's pretty close, huh?
They soon rented an apartment and moved in together. At first, Linda seemed happier than ever. But recently, she wondered if she'd made a mistake. She told her mother that Rogers had a bad temper and she feared his mood swings. When Linda stopped calling and didn't answer her apartment door, her mother believed that Rogers had harmed her. Again, Rogers was nowhere to be found. Jackson detectives believed he had left the area. They entered his name into the NCIC database. Learning Rogers was wanted for murder in California, they contacted Detective Mike Koblenz in Los Angeles.
Jackson, Mississippi at that time contacted me, informed me of a murder they had, and they wanted more information on Glenn Rogers as he was a possible perpetrator in that case.
The murders followed a pattern. The victims in California and Mississippi had both been charmed by Rogers. They had been isolated from others, then brutally killed just before Rogers fled the area. The investigators believed that Rogers was on a rampage that probably would not stop until he was found.
In our minds, we knew that we had a major problem going on here. We felt if he wasn't apprehended, that there could very well be more victims.
Jackson police asked the public to call if anyone saw Rogers in the area. Witnesses reported sightings, but Rogers stayed one step ahead of authorities. The detectives contacted the FBI field office in Jackson.
Hey, got three other pictures from the crime scene. I think you're gonna find.
They believed Rogers had left the state like he did after the California killing. Agents filed a federal warrant for unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. Perhaps federal resources could help stop the killer. FBI Special Agent John Huber helped coordinate the multi-state investigation.
This case was very high speed, very fast. The murder he committed in Jackson was on November 3rd, it was Linda Price. Subsequent to that, he committed another murder on November 6th.
On that date, police in Tampa, Florida responded to a murder scene at a local motel room that had been rented by Glenn Rogers. Like Linda Price, the young woman lay dead in the bathtub, stabbed in the back, chest, and wrist. There was no ID of the woman in the room, but investigators noted a tattoo of a cross on her shoulder. Her jeans and shoes were piled near the toilet. A bracelet was found in the sink. From the evidence left behind, Tampa homicide detective Julie Masucci attempted to piece together the details of the murder.
When we removed the clothing, it appeared that she had been stabbed through the clothing, which means that she was never undressed. And it was from the rear portion, which appeared that someone might have come up behind her and stabbed her.
The shoes had blood spots on the top, indicating she had them on and was standing when she was attacked. Under her body was a man's watch. Investigators believed it belonged to the killer.
It was significant that she was placed in a bathtub and that it appeared that someone tried to clean up any evidence that they left behind. We had found towels to indicate someone had wiped up blood off of a floor. It appeared that the bathtub water had been run to try and clean up any evidence that was left behind.
The detective interviewed the housekeeper who discovered the body. That morning, she had been making her daily rounds just after checkout time. Outside room 119, she spotted a handwritten "Do Not Disturb" sign.
Housekeeping!
She said she didn't clean the room the day before because she saw the sign and wanted to respect the privacy of the people staying there. On this day, the occupants were scheduled to have checked out. When she entered the bathroom, she made the gruesome discovery. Detectives asked the motel manager if she knew about the people staying in room 119. She recalled the man who rented the room because he requested a "Do Not Disturb" sign the day before.
They told him he didn't have one. So he paid for another night and told them at the registration that he did not want them cleaning his room. He wanted it to be left alone. Apparently he went back to the room and tore off a piece of a phone book and made his own "Do Not Disturb" sign, and he hung it on the door.
The motel manager remembered the same man packing up a small white car that evening. He had paid for another night, so she didn't think he was leaving. She warned him about recent break-ins at the motel and told him not to leave anything in the car overnight.
Thanks. Good, I'll go.
The detectives checked the office records, finding the registration card for room 119. It had Glenn Rogers' name and signature on it. Technicians would later recover prints matching Rogers from the card. Detective Masucci ran a computer check and saw the California and Mississippi murder warrants. She contacted the other agencies and the FBI.
Then we started to realize very quickly into the investigation that there was a possibility that this man, Mr. Glenn Rogers, was a serial killer.
The investigators knew who the killer was, but Tampa detectives still had not identified the female victim. She remained at the morgue as Jane Doe. If they could identify her, it might help them find the man who had killed her and at least 2 others. In the fall of 1995, after linking murders in California, Mississippi, and Florida to one man, the FBI and local detectives searched for accused serial killer Glenn Rogers. The latest victim had been found in a Tampa motel room. She was still unidentified. Responding to media coverage, a woman whose daughter had been missing for 2 days came forward. She positively identified the body of her daughter, Tina Marie Cribbs. Tina had 2 children of her own. Tina's mother told Detective Julie Masucci about her daughter's last day.
We learned that Tina had worked and that she went to the Showtime bar, which is in Gibsonton, and she met some friends there. She was supposed to meet her mother there. Apparently it's like a family bar where a lot of people go and there's televisions in there and they just go and gather and talk.
Detectives visited the Showtime bar. The bartender said she knew Tina and her mother. She confirmed that Tina had been in the bar on November 5th. The bartender also remembered that a man named Glenn was there the same night.
How you nice ladies doing?
He talked with Tina and the others.
Let me do it for you, let a good time roll. So you want bartender?
He bought a round of drinks with a $100 bill. The bartender said the man was very friendly and won Tina over quickly.
She started talking to a gentleman that was...
Eventually, he asked Tina for a ride home. He said his motel room was close and promised Tina would be back in time to meet her mother.
Everything's taken care of, right? All right, great, thanks.
Tina finally agreed and told the others she'd be right back.
When the mother came to the Showtime bar, she sat there and waited, and her daughter didn't show up. So she said she started beeping her to find out where she was. And she said that she had such a close-knit relationship with her daughter that she immediately knew something was wrong when she didn't answer her pages.
Detective Masucci also learned that Tina owned a white Ford Festiva, the same kind of car the Tampa motel manager had seen Rogers packing with suitcases. She updated the NCIC report on Rogers, adding the Festiva and its license plate number to the fugitive's information. FBI Special Agent John Huber was surprised that Rogers wasn't trying to conceal himself.
Glenn Rogers seemed to not care if he would get caught or had no fear of the law. He would always use his real name when dealing with people and checking into motels. He would drive cars that weren't stolen, either belonged to the victim, which he could easily be linked to, or his own vehicle. He didn't seem to care if people knew what was happening. He wasn't trying to hide.
The search for the serial killer hit the news. TV stations across the Southeast broadcast pictures of Rogers, asking anyone spotting him to call authorities. Hundreds of leads poured into the FBI. One promising tip came from a Jackson, Mississippi motel. 2 separate callers claimed to have seen Rogers there. Rogers had been in Jackson previously and was known to frequent small motels.
We set up a perimeter around the hotel, and then we had an entry team go up to the door.
Police, come to the door! Come to the door with your hands up! Come to the door! Hands where we can see them! Take your hands, get your hands!
Agents were cautious until they could identify the man.
Put that on the wall! Where is it? It's the wall.
We identified the person that resembled Rogers and determined that it was not him. We then later searched the entire hotel and began searching the hotels in the immediate vicinity, but didn't find him. It was very important in this case to apprehend this individual as soon as possible, because based on his history, he was going to continue to kill until he was apprehended.
Authorities were desperate to stop him. The serial killer was out there somewhere, and it was likely that he was searching for his next victim. In the fall of 1995, suspected serial killer Glenn Rogers had been last seen in Florida. The FBI believed he had murdered a woman there after killing women in California and Mississippi. The FBI soon learned that Louisiana had been his next stop. On November 10, 1995, Andy Sutton, the mother of four, was found murdered in her Bossier City, Louisiana apartment. Like two others, she had multiple stab wounds to her upper body and back. The Bossier City detective questioned the victim's roommate and former boyfriend.
9 o'clock.
Andy's roommate was a waitress and had worked late the night before Andy was killed.
Went in together.
When she returned home in the early morning hours, she heard the bedroom door close. She assumed it was Andy and her new boyfriend, Glenn Rogers, in the apartment's one bedroom. Blankets had been left on the couch, and so she slept there. After daybreak, she was awakened by someone at the apartment door.
Would you tell Andy I'm here?
It was Andy's ex-boyfriend.
No, I'm sorry. I'm here now. I'd like to see Andy.
He wanted to talk to Andy.
I don't care. I'd still like to see him.
Stay there. Andy? Andy?
In the room, she found Andy's body under the sheet. She told detectives Andy had met Glenn Rogers in a bar. They had been dating for only a few days. Neighbors had seen Rogers leave in a white Festiva. Bossier City detectives ran Rogers' name through the NCIC and saw the 3 other murder warrants. They contacted the other police agencies and the FBI.
Hey, detective. Here's that fax report.
Los Angeles faxed a photo of Rogers to be used in the local investigation. Louisiana television stations picked up the story. Viewers were asked to be on the lookout for Rogers, but they were warned not to approach the deadly fugitive. Special Agent John Huber and the other investigators were frustrated.
Yeah, you know it.
Rogers was killing people faster than we could investigate where he was. It was just a kind of a time game, and he was killing people faster than we could apprehend him.
Hey guys, look at
The FBI and local detectives believed Rogers murdered 4 women in 6 weeks. After each killing, Rogers had fled the state.
Let's try to focus.
The locations he chose were random.
Let's try to focus in over here.
Despite their best efforts, investigators couldn't keep up. They needed to spread the description of Rogers and his vehicle across the country.
Let's start off with that.
Agents sent requests to truckers over their CBs to be on the lookout for a white Ford Festiva. They posted wanted flyers in truck stops and rest areas.
We're not really sure where he's going to be going next. That's why
They held press
below here is
conferences
a
to get
photograph
Rogers' photo out to the public.
And Gallagher will pass some of this out.
They wanted to warn
Right now,
potential
what we do know
victims
is,
and hoped someone would spot the
that
killer.
we have already.
Through the media, agents released details of Rogers' MO for finding victims and the route he traveled.
raped and murdered.
The FBI began the process of adding Rogers to their 10 most wanted list.
1996, at the rear of a convalescent.
Getting someone on the 10 most wanted list increases the amount of resources that the Bureau puts into a case. It also increases the amount of media attention that's also worked into a case.
The tips began to increase. One caller claimed Glenn Rogers was at a pool hall in Mississippi. 2 agents responded. One of the pitfalls of an intense media campaign are the many false sightings that well-intentioned citizens call in.
Well, gentlemen, Special Agent Huber.
The man in the bar was obviously not Rogers. The investigators tried to predict Rogers' next move and focus their search. Special Agent Huber had worked plenty of fugitive cases.
A lot of times in fugitive investigations, when people are in trouble, they'll go to areas that they're familiar with, or associates or friends. In this particular case, Rogers' family and friends were mostly located in the Kentucky area, and that's where a lot of our resources were focused.
Authorities in Kentucky received priority teletypes about the fugitive. Kentucky State Police Detective Bob Stevens was already familiar with the name Glenn Rogers. In fact, he'd been looking for him for almost 2 years. Rogers was wanted for questioning in the disappearance and possible murder of his housemate, 71-year-old Mark Peters. Almost 2 years before Glenn Rogers' cross-country crime spree began, his brother had called the Kentucky State Police.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here.
The body had been found inside his family's cabin. Police believed it was Mark Peters. Peters had last been seen with Rogers. The cord tied around the corpse's hands and feet matched one found in the home the men shared. Authorities could not determine the cause of death, and they couldn't find Rogers.
1029 on it, please. The case is still ongoing and still pending. We had one suspect, which was Glenn Rogers. We weren't able to track Rogers real well due to the fact that he traveled by Greyhound bus, by tractor trailer, cars. It was hard for us to track him. So we had a hard time trying to know where his next step was.
Still, the investigative focus in Kentucky paid off. On November 13th, 1995, Glenn Rogers visited one of his relatives in Lee County, Kentucky. When he left, she called the Kentucky State Police.
Hi, I think you're looking for my nephew. Glenn Rogers.
She said he was driving a small white car heading west toward Interstate 75. When Detective Stevens heard that Rogers was sighted nearby, he set up on the road he believed Rogers would take to I-75. It wasn't long before a white Ford Festiva drove by. The detective began following.
I wanted to make sure that this was Glenn Rogers, not somebody else that I had actually followed in behind. So I pulled out behind this car. When I ran the car tags actually came back stolen. So I began to follow him. I was able to pull up beside him like I was going to pass him. When I looked over, I could see who it was, and the picture I had of Glenn Rogers matched the driver.
The detective requested backup. A local police officer was parked nearby. He joined the slow pursuit. They followed Rogers for a distance.
I think he was kind of watching me, and I was watching him. And I think by then he must have pretty much figured out that he had a police officer behind him. So we pulled up to a stoplight, and he ran the stoplight and pretty much ran some people off the road as he was going through the stoplight. I fell in behind him at that time and activated my emergency equipment.
Rogers didn't stop. He sped up.
He's on to us now. Stand by.
Several miles ahead, police set up a roadblock and tried to clear the road of traffic. They hoped this would be the last stop for the elusive killer. On November 13th, 1995, Kentucky State Police set up a roadblock in an effort to apprehend suspected serial killer Glenn Rogers. Armed officers waited at the roadblock.
Shoot his tires! Shoot his tires!
They fired at his tires, but they didn't stop the killer. Detective Bob Stevens was close behind.
We followed him down the road. He had run several cars off the highway, ran a school bus off the highway. He was driving on the wrong side of the highway. And so it was determined that he had to be stopped. Sergeant Barnes was able to get up the other side of him, and when he came back, he tapped him, spun him out of the highway, off the highway into a ditch.
They didn't know if the fugitive was armed.
When I first approached the car, and I was one of the first ones to approach the car, you could see that he looked very upset, very aggravated that he was in the custody. He was very defiant and just didn't want to be taken into custody at that time.
After a 2-month killing spree that spanned the country and left 4 women dead, Glenn Rogers was finally in custody. The vehicle identification number of the white Festiva confirmed the car belonged to Tina Marie Cribbs, the victim in Florida. Technicians scoured the car for evidence. They found shorts with blood on them, a blanket, and a woman's purse. These and other items linked Rogers to the murders in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Florida.
Tell me a little bit about what you guys have.
The FBI served as the clearinghouse for the evidence. FBI agents and detectives from 5 states met in Kentucky to outline the case. Special Agent John Huber helped plan the meeting.
What they did do was put together all the information that everyone had, share information, and also that the FBI laboratory would process all the evidence in this case so that one agency would have custody of all the evidence and do the analysis.
Agents and detectives agreed that their best case against Rogers was in Florida. Tampa detective Julie Masucci met with detectives and prosecutors to review the evidence. They believe the watch found in the tub with the victim belonged to Rogers. A photograph of Rogers with Mississippi victim Linda Price revealed he wore that type of watch. Detective Masucci was confident in her case due to the physical evidence implicating Rogers.
We had Tina Cribbs' car that he was apprehended in. We had some shorts that belonged to him that had some of Tina Cribbs' DNA on them. the registration slip that Mr. Rogers signed himself, fingerprints that were found inside of motel room number 119, where the victim was found, and miscellaneous items that were found inside of the car when he was apprehended.
On July 11th, 1997, almost 2 years after the murder of Tina Marie Cribbs in a Tampa motel room, Glenn Rogers was convicted of first-degree murder and later sentenced to death in Florida. 2 years later, Rogers was extradited to Los Angeles to stand trial for the strangulation death of Sandra Gallagher, whose body was burned in a truck fire.
She poured over the victim's body and in the cab of the truck. He was seen.
Prosecutors outlined the victim's final hours for the jury. They showed that Sandra and Glenn Rogers left McRed's bar together on September 28, 1995. At some point, there was a struggle, perhaps as Rogers made an unwanted sexual advance. He strangled her, crushing her windpipe. Attempting to destroy evidence, Rogers doused Sandra's body in the truck with gasoline and set it ablaze. Then he ran. On July 16, 1999, a jury again found Glenn Rogers guilty of murder. He was sentenced to a second death penalty in the state of California. Los Angeles detective Mike Koblenz was impressed by the nationwide partnership of everyone involved in the hunt for Rogers.
That's really what made this case come together, was the interagency cooperation, and not just in Los Angeles, but in Jackson, Mississippi, Tampa, Florida, and later Bossier City, Louisiana, the FBI, the press, the different news agencies that were able to get the information out. We truly worked together on this, and it came to a successful conclusion down the road.
Since Glenn Rogers already had 2 death sentences, Louisiana and Mississippi prosecutors decided to spare the families of the victims emotional trials. Glenn Rogers left at least 11 children without mothers. The importance of stopping him was clear to Detective Julie Masucci and the other investigators.
As a woman, not as a detective, not as a police officer, but as a female, I think that there should be a lot of women that feel safe that he's off of the streets. He had no regard for human life. He had no regard for the feelings of the families that are left behind. He didn't care. And I'm happy that he's behind bars. And I'm happy that he'll never step foot outside of a prison system that he could put other females at risk.
Investigators suspect Rogers is responsible for more unsolved murders. He told family members during his rampage that he had killed dozens. Authorities continue to pursue those unsolved murders to close the cases that can be linked to Glenn Rogers. The nation's railroads become the conduit of a killer. He strikes at random, then disappears. Recurring clues tell police they face the worst predator of all, a ritual serial killer. He's cunning, deadly, and on the move. But the authorities are determined to stop him in his tracks.
More than 200,000 miles of train track crossed the United States. From California to Kentucky, few living near a railroad felt safe in the summer of 1999. A serial killer rode the rails, picking towns and victims at random. He left behind a trail of bloodshed, but no trace of where he would turn up next. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. As the number of victims grew, the FBI enlisted the help of a profiler to help predict the killer's next move.
On December 17, 1998, in West University Place, Texas, a young woman called the police from outside the house of a friend she worked with. She was worried about her. She told them that her friend, a prominent doctor at a nearby medical school, had failed to show up at work that morning.
222, we'll be arriving on the scene.
Look, here they are.
According to her colleague, this was completely out of character. She had not responded to phone calls to the house all day, nor had she answered her door.
When we hung up, everything was fine. She said she'd see me tomorrow. And nothing out of the ordinary. And that was yesterday.
The colleague was sure that something was wrong.
It's just not like her to do this. I'm just very concerned about it.
The doors and windows of the house were locked. From the outside, everything seemed normal.
It's just not like her to miss an important paper, an important day like this.
The officers found that the garage door was unlocked. And inside, the door to the house, wide open. Jewelry on the floor suggested a robbery.
222, I'm ready to use the bag as soon as possible for it.
The house had been ransacked. The officers moved cautiously. An intruder could still be inside. The downstairs was clear. But a trail of clothes led to the second floor. In the master bedroom, they found the doctor. She had been brutally murdered.
222, let me have a supervisor and a crime scene unit to the scene.
Detective Kenneth Maha responded to the scene. Though a 10-year veteran of the department, he was surprised by the report of a homicide.
West University Place, just a small little suburb, 2.2 square miles, right in the middle of Houston, largely residential and an affluent community. And the last time we had a murder was in 1985 during a robbery of a pharmacy.
The brutality of the crime struck the detective.
Blood spatter was all over the place, in the hallway and on the walls and the door. The body was completely covered except for one arm sticking out and her two legs. There was a large butcher knife that was near the body, laying on a pillow.
Investigators also recovered a heavy, blood-spattered blunt object nearby. Both were weapons of opportunity the killer found in the house. Police contacted the doctor's husband and learned he had taken the couple's 2 children out of town to visit relatives before Christmas. They'd been gone for several days.
The victim had work obligations to take care of that week, so she was not able to travel with him.
Take a look at this over here.
Evidence suggested that the killer had taken his time in the house. He tore open Christmas gifts and rummaged through the victim's belongings.
The contents of her purse were spilled out, and her driver's license was clearly left out and displayed. It was quite strange to see it like that.
In the kitchen, the detective found partially eaten fruit. Possibly more evidence the killer had lingered in the house. He also found the keys to the victim's Jeep. According to the doctor's husband, it was the only set. In the garage, there were no foreign fingerprints at the suspected point of entry. But on a workbench, investigators found the broken cover of a steering column next to some pry tools. The killer must have stolen the victim's Jeep.
We surmised then that he had to break the steering column of the Jeep to actually crank it up and to start it.
Here, the murderer made a crucial mistake.
When I picked up the large piece of the steering column, I could visibly see fingerprints on the shiny black plastic.
The column cover was bagged for later analysis at the lab. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined cause of death: multiple stab wounds and blunt force trauma to the head. The victim had been sexually assaulted. The gruesome nature of the murder worried Detective Maha.
It just didn't fit the pattern of a random killing. It was a step beyond.
Investigators knew that killers like this usually don't strike only once. 2 days later, and 200 miles away, San Antonio police found an abandoned Jeep in a motel parking lot. The plates were traced to West University Place. It belonged to the doctor. The plastic cover of the steering column was missing. Inside, investigators found a guitar and a meat cleaver. The doctor's husband had noted that both items were missing from the house. Someone had hotwired the Jeep in a hurry.
We noticed too that the steering column was just in absolute disarray.
The Jeep was fingerprinted inside and out, but technicians found no usable prints. At the police department's forensics lab, analysts made electronic copies of the fingerprints lifted from the Jeep's steering column cover and ran them through an automated matching system.
And at that time, we got a positive match on an individual named Carlos Rodriguez.
A computer check revealed another name, Rafael Resendez Ramirez. This was forwarded to the FBI's Criminal Justice Information Services Division. A search of their extensive database revealed dozens of other aliases and more information on Resendez. He had an extensive record going back more than 20 years and an active warrant on a stolen vehicle charge. Investigators reviewed the suspect's file from the Immigration and Naturalization Service and learned Resendez traveled regularly and illegally between the United States and Mexico. Most recently, he had been arrested in California for trespassing on railroad property with a loaded firearm and was deported to Mexico. Now it appeared that Rafael Resendez was back in Texas. His transient lifestyle would make him difficult to find. Detective Maha searched the suspect's records for a place to start and found the name of the fugitive's sister. She lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico. In a prearranged phone conference, Maha spoke with her at the Albuquerque Police Department.
I'd be able to get some things, some information about your brother, if that'd be all right. She wasn't able to tell me a whole lot about current activity of her brother. She did not have much contact with him. She did mention that he would sometimes drift through Albuquerque, stay with her for a few days, and then just disappear.
Detective Maha asked her to call if she heard from her brother.
And I think there was a little bit of anger and resentment on her part at having to be involved with it. She really didn't want to be associated with him, if indeed he was a real killer as we thought that he was.
Authorities also asked the public for help. They distributed wanted posters along the train routes Resendez was known to use. Dozens of tips turned up nothing. In March, 3 months after the doctor's murder, there was a series of reported sightings in rail yards near San Antonio.
Sector 1, this is Sector 2. I've got
Resendez had traveled 200 miles west. Each time, he fled before police could respond. The suspected killer was still on the move, hopping trains and eluding authorities. With thousands of miles of train tracks to choose from, Rafael Resendez could be anywhere. Five months after the doctor's murder, and only 90 miles away in Weimar, Texas, members of a local church went to check on their pastor. He and his wife had not been at church that morning.
The door's wide open. Pastor! Pastor! Pastor!
The couple was found, murdered in their own bed. Weimar's a small town. Murder is nearly unheard of. Texas Rangers and the Fort Bend County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene. The preacher and his wife had been bludgeoned to death with a sledgehammer, a weapon of opportunity taken from their garage. The coroner set time of death at 24 to 36 hours earlier. The couple had been murdered late Friday or early Saturday morning. Money and valuables lay in plain sight. Robbery was clearly not the motive. Deputies processed the bedroom with luminol, a chemical that reacts to the protein in blood and other bodily fluids. It revealed the victim's blood and bodily fluid from an unknown source. Forensic testing later revealed the woman had been sexually assaulted. It appeared that after the murders, the killer had lingered at the crime scene. He ate in the victim's kitchen and took his time studying their driver's licenses. The investigators at the scene were unaware of the West University Place murder, but not for long. In May 1999, Texas authorities were on the trail of a fugitive, Rafael Resendez. Fingerprints implicated him in the murder of a doctor in West University Place. 4 months later, a preacher and his wife were found beaten to death in their home in Weimar. The couple's red pickup truck was missing, probably stolen by the killer. Police put out an APB for the vehicle. At the Department of Public Safety, investigators from the Texas Rangers were troubled by the crime scene. The evidence in the house, partially eaten food and displayed ID cards, suggested a ritualistic killer. The Rangers contacted the FBI's Houston field office to get the opinion of a criminal profiler, Special Agent Mark Young.
You have in a crime scene a lot of messages, a lot of forensic evidence, and a lot of behavioral evidence. You can pick up not only the forensics, the fingerprints, the DNA, the hairs and fibers, and those types of things, but you can also get a look into the offender's behavior. The way he commits that crime is unique. It's different than any other offender.
Young noted that this killer acted with extreme rage, but no sign of panic.
What really struck me behaviorally was this offender, unlike a lot of others, spent an incredible amount of time in that house going through everything. Their wallet and purse, respectively, were opened up, and their identification was showing. In other words, the offender sat there and looked at their photographs, not taking any credit cards, not taking any cash.
Profilers can analyze a killer's behavioral choices in an attempt to reveal details about him. In this case, after killing the victims, the perpetrator kept striking with his weapon. But then he covered their bodies. This suggested perhaps even he was repelled by the results of his actions. Displaying the victims' ID cards might be an act of domination, as if he wanted details about the lives he had taken. One of the Texas Rangers Young spoke to had seen something like this before.
He realized, because he had some knowledge of the case in West University, that some of the same types of things had happened. And he said, hey guys, could this be connected? Not only are we looking at some MO that seems similar, but we're looking at behavior, this ritualistic behavior, or what we call sometimes signature of an offender.
If there was a connection between the two cases, the forensics lab would find it.
One of the advantages we had is that we had forensic evidence in both places. We had fingerprints and DNA evidence in the West University case. We also had DNA evidence at the Weimar location.
DNA analysis revealed that the bodily fluid recovered in both cases matched. The same man sexually assaulted both women. Since the first victim's Jeep had been recovered, investigators wondered how the killer got to the second crime scene. In both cases, a vehicle had been stolen after the crime.
That would have meant, traditionally, that somebody had to bring the person there, or that they were somebody from close by.
Young studied the case file of suspect Rafael Resendez.
There was information already in that fugitive investigation indicating that Resendez got around by train.
According to the file, there were train tracks 50 yards from the doctor's house in West University Place.
We turned around and looked. There's a train track immediately across the street from the Weimar location.
With the two cases directly connected, investigators believed Rafael Resendez was a ritual serial killer.
The manner that he did these crimes is somewhat evolutionary. You don't just wake up one day and boom, get involved in that type of crime. It's something that you've practiced, you've built up to, and you've done before. And he's not going to stop all of a sudden either.
They feared Resendez was using stolen vehicles and the railroads to find his next victim. At the Houston field office, the FBI's fugitive squad joined the hunt for Resendez. Special Agent Bobby Eckert led the investigation.
We knew that he had fled the jurisdiction and had most likely traveled interstate and, in fact, into Mexico.
Because Resendez had likely left Texas, they obtained an unlawful flight to avoid prosecution warrant.
57, 1959.
It would allow the FBI to add its federal resources to the hunt.
The first thing that we wanted to do is to find out everything that we possibly could about Resendez. We knew that he had been arrested over 13 times. I immediately started getting all the prison record pin packets so that I could identify not only relatives but associates, determine his patterns. All the interviews revealed to us that this was a man who was not well known by anybody. His family had not really had a lot of contact with him since he left home at 12 years of age and moved to Acapulco and eventually to Florida.
With little to go on, criminal profiler Mark Young tried to unlock the drifter's past to predict his next move. He forwarded details of both cases to analysts at the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. VICAP analysts use sophisticated databases to identify similar unsolved cases.
Immediately, they were able to return to me a case in Lexington, Kentucky. A Hispanic male had assaulted a college student and murdered her boyfriend. This happened late at night in 1997 near the railroad tracks where these two had been walking. The male was killed by his skull being crushed by a rock, and the female was sexually assaulted. She was also physically assaulted, pretty severe injuries.
Though dazed by the attack, the young woman somehow survived. Seeing that her boyfriend was dead, she made her way to a nearby house where residents called the police.
She was able to give them an artist depiction, through a local artist, of the offender.
Young received the sketch from the Lexington Police Department.
I compared it, and I didn't immediately say, wow, you know, this is him. What I felt was kind of a guarded optimism that this could be the same guy.
But a sketch isn't proof. Young needed scientific evidence to be sure. He learned that the Lexington police still had DNA samples from the sexual assault 2 years earlier, and arranged for the samples to be flown to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. At the DNA analysis unit, examiners began processing the samples.
A couple samples to be worked.
Examiner Alan Giusti.
Homicide out of Kentucky. We look at 13 different unique DNA regions, and we develop an individual profile at each one of those regions. I describe it like looking at a person's physical characteristics. You can look at one DNA region and it might be the same as another person's. And that'd be like saying that two people both have brown eyes. Well, that's very common. You look at 13 different DNA regions, it's like saying somebody has brown eyes, is left-handed, is 6'3", is got red hair. The more DNA regions you look at, the more complete the picture you get of the person.
After mapping the DNA profile of the perpetrator from Lexington, Giusti contacted the examiners in Texas who had mapped the samples from Weimar and West University Place.
By comparing the results that I obtained with the results they obtained, we were both able to determine that we had a possible common donor. In other words, the same person was committing these crimes.
In Texas, Young forwarded the news to the other investigators.
I was able to call Lexington PD, and I heard a lot of hooping and hollering because they thought it was going to be an unsolved case.
Lexington police now had Rafael Resendez as their prime suspect. Authorities across the Southwest canvassed homeless shelters and train yards. They knew Resendez was out there, somewhere. On May 28th, authorities found the preacher's truck abandoned near a train yard in San Antonio. It looked like Resendez had returned to the rails. Finding him would be an overwhelming task for Special Agent Eckert and her team.
We had never faced this type of obstacle before. There are thousands of tracks, there are thousands of trains every day. And it was difficult to determine which line that he rode.
With a massive search area to cover, they had to be resourceful.
One way we handled this is we developed a small wanted poster that we gave to the people that frequently rode the railroads.
In train yards across the nation, locals were advised to be on the lookout for Rafael Resendez. If they spotted him, they should call the FBI fugitive squad immediately.
When we received these calls, we would contact the railroad police. They would pull the person off the train and identify them.
Agents and railroad police responded to hundreds of sightings. Each time, it wasn't Resendez. The FBI's best lead was the fugitive's sister in New Mexico. Agents stayed in contact with her, hoping she might hear from him.
If for any reason he's contacting you,
And if she did hear from him, they hoped she'd talk.
No, I told you the last time we spoke that...
So far, it seemed the only way to track Resendez was to follow a trail of bodies. On June 4th, 1999, a Fayette County, Texas woman stopped by her mother's house to check on her. The 73-year-old widow lived alone. The house had been ransacked.
Mom?
There was no sign of her mother.
Mom?
As she searched each room, her panic rose.
Mother!
Then, in the bedroom, she found her mother's body. The elderly woman had been bludgeoned to death. In 1999, agents were on the trail of Rafael Resendez, linked to 4 murders in Texas and Kentucky. As his notoriety grew, the press dubbed him the Railroad Killer. Now, an elderly widow had been murdered in rural Fayette County, Texas. Like the other victims, she lived near a railroad. The gruesome crime looked like the work of Rafael Resendez, according to FBI Special Agent Mark Young.
When you looked at that real brutal style of murder, you felt like, yeah, okay, you're dealing with the same guy, because she was covered similarly. There were jewelry boxes that had been opened up in other rooms. Things had been opened and gone through, and there were items taken.
It was a familiar and disturbing pattern. Cash and jewelry had been left behind. Instead, the killer stole trinkets and personal items, as if taking souvenirs. Fingerprints in the laundry room indicated the killer had broken in through a rear window. The print was later matched to Resendez. After slaying his victim, he was in no rush to leave.
Not only did he go around to all of the rooms, take certain items, and spend an inordinate amount of time, he went and had some fruit and some bread, which was a thing that we had seen a number of times. I take that to be more of a signature, showing that I totally own and dominate this individual and their belongings, more than I'm hungry and I need something to eat.
2 distinctive clues at the Fayette County scene seemed intended as a message to investigators. A newspaper had been placed on the sofa, open to an article about the recovery of the preacher's stolen vehicle. In a guest bedroom, they found a toy train. It had been recently unpacked and set up on the bed. It seemed the railroad killer was taunting the authorities. A canine unit followed his scent to the train tracks. From there, the trail went cold. Less than 24 hours later, the next victim was discovered. Another gruesome murder near railroad tracks. This one 95 miles from Fayette County.
I got a call in regard to a crime scene in Houston that was being assessed by the Houston Police Department. They were noticing some similarities.
A 26-year-old school teacher was found sexually assaulted and bludgeoned to death in her bedroom. Her driver's license had been removed from her wallet and displayed on a table. Like the other victims, she lived near railroad tracks. The teacher's car, a white Honda sedan, had been stolen. Later DNA analysis confirmed Resendez had assaulted the woman. Now he was killing at a much faster pace.
One of the concerns we did have was that this guy was going to evolve into what we call a spree killer. A lot of times in the past, we've had serial killers, Ted Bundy, for instance, that the pressure got so great that they went into a spree mode, and that is they began to kill a number of victims with really no cooling off period.
With his last two victims killed in a 24-hour period, it appeared Resendez had made the shift to spree killer.
2014, three-step protection on the conductor. Step in there, air and brake, go out.
On June 6th, a rail yard worker spotted the fugitive in Flatonia, Texas, halfway between Houston and San Antonio.
2014, we have a trespass on premises. Call Central Dispatch, running westbound.
He immediately notified local police and the FBI.
2014, we got an emergency situation. Male Hispanic, westbound.
Once again, Resendez slipped away.
Okay, guys, we've got some additional information.
At the Houston FBI field office, Operation Train Stop was created. Now investigators from more than 30 agencies were assigned exclusively to the case.
You'll remember we got involved.
Special Agent Bobby Eckert was part of the operation that was comprised of two basic squads.
You had the one squad that was the serial homicide investigators that were looking into the various homicides, developing evidence of crimes. Then the other side was the fugitive investigators that their sole purpose was to locate, apprehend, and arrest Resendez.
The fugitive squad looked for patterns in the suspect's past.
We were able to determine that he followed the crops throughout the United States. In Washington State, he followed the avocado route. In Florida, he would be involved in the citrus crops. In Kentucky and North Carolina, he would pick tobacco.
After identifying farm work sites and addresses of friends and family, agents would try to eliminate these comfort zones.
You go everywhere that you can possibly think of that the fugitive might show up. By going there, by law enforcement presence in those places, people aren't willing to help out the fugitive anymore.
But this fugitive was comfortable traveling fast and on his own without any help. And his murder spree was not yet over. 8 days after the school teacher was killed in Houston, her car was found 300 miles away near the Mexican border. Inside was a knife, but no sign of where Resendez had gone. Nearby were train tracks, giving the killer a clean escape to almost anywhere. In 1999, more than 30 law enforcement agencies hunted for Rafael Resendez, known as the Railroad Killer. Whenever a new crime appeared to be the work of the killer, Special Agent Mark Young investigated.
I was getting hundreds of calls from departments around the country wanting me to listen to their stories about their crimes and determine whether the cases might be linked.
On June 15th, the bodies of a 51-year-old woman and her father were discovered in their home in rural Gorham, Illinois. The local sheriff's office believed Resendez was involved and called Mark Young.
Sexual assault apparently took place.
As soon as we walked onto the scene, we could have been in one of our crime scenes in Texas. The double rail tracks were right behind the older man's residence.
The killer broke in through a back window. He used a weapon of opportunity, a shotgun he found in the home. He stole a few trinkets and ate the victim's food. But this time the killer had added something new, a statement scrawled on the wall.
A lot of people thought, oh God, we got some other type of offender here that's making a political statement. Pseudo-intellectual type individual.
But Young knew better. He had reviewed the fugitive's prison file, including his correspondence.
He had been writing political messages and letters that we were able to view in the past. That was even further indication to me that this is the same offender, because this now is the rest of his fantasy coming out.
In his own mind, Resendez was a deep political thinker. But authorities knew he was a vicious predator.
He was tied up in this chair. She was draped across the coffee table.
They believed he got to Gorham on the train and left in the victim's car, which was recovered the next day 60 miles south near the Kentucky border. Police across the country checked cold cases looking for murders Resendez might have committed. Special Agent Young investigated one in Hughes Springs, Texas. In October of 1998, a woman had been beaten to death with an antique flat iron. Though unsolved, the murder had been thoroughly investigated and documented.
And I felt like there was a good possibility that Resendez was responsible for that case too. Didn't you tell me? We had blunt force trauma. She was an elderly victim. She was not sexually assaulted, but she was covered in a similar fashion. And in looking at his crime scene photography, I see where her identification had been placed up as if the offender looked at it, because it happened at home.
Because the spree killer could be anywhere, the FBI placed Rafael Resendez on their 10 most wanted fugitives list. His mugshots were posted with 30 different aliases. Special Agent Bobby Eckert hoped it might shake new leads free.
What this does is it raises the awareness of the case, the fugitive status, and it also allowed for us to offer up to $50,000 for the successful apprehension of Resendez.
News of the Resendez case swept through the country. On heightened alert, agents and police searched hundreds of freight trains and train yards. It was as if Resendez had disappeared. Don Clark, then special agent in charge of the Houston field office, held press conferences to help spread the word. But he was candid about the case's difficulty.
It's a very complex investigation. It's one like many of us have never been involved with before. We are dealing with a lot of unknowns here. We're dealing with a lot of pieces of information, and it's a very difficult investigation for all of the agencies.
The story led news broadcasts nationwide. And with 8 victims now dead, the public was terrified.
8 is more than enough, many more than enough. 1 is more than enough. And that's all that I can assure the public, is that law enforcement is working together to try and get this person out of the street.
The fugitive was deceptively smart and incredibly dangerous. He could move across the country easily and slip across the border at will.
What we were trying to let people know was this is not some railroad hobo or bum that doesn't have any sense traveling around. This is a guy with a good IQ that knew how to evade law enforcement, that we needed a lot of assistance in capturing. This is a guy that was attacking innocent people in their sleep, and there was nobody really safe.
The reward for the fugitive's capture climbed to $125,000. Calls came in from all over the country.
I'd like to, thank you.
In late June, Resendez was spotted at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky. But he never stayed in one place for long. Before the police could arrive, he was gone. Sergeant Mark Barnard of the Lexington, Kentucky Police Department warned the public.
If I lived near a railroad track, I'd certainly have it well lit. I'd check and make sure nothing is out of the ordinary. I'd know my environment, my neighbors. I'd check my doors and windows.
The tips kept coming.
We had 3,178 calls that came into the command post. From those calls, we generated over 1,100 leads. In other words, things that needed to be done throughout the United States and in Mexico.
One credible tip was phoned into the Denver field office. The caller reported seeing Resendez at a house in Commerce City, Colorado. After authorities traced a phone call from the house to the Mexico town where Resendez had family, a tactical arrest team responded and moved in for the capture. 7 months into the search for Rafael Resendez, an arrest team raided a house in Commerce City, Colorado. They secured the occupants and searched the house. But Resendez was nowhere to be found. And authorities later determined the tip was a case of mistaken identity. Texas Rangers and the FBI agents kept in contact with the fugitive's sister in New Mexico. She assured them that she had not heard from her brother, but promised that if he called, she would contact them.
I'd like to take a look at these photographs.
But at the FBI command post in Houston, the next big lead concerned a relative no one knew about before. Agents learned Resendez had a wife in Mexico. Special Agent Bobby Eckert followed up on the surprising new lead.
The command post became aware that he had a common-law wife because she was interviewed by Mexican media. And a local station got a copy of that interview and aired it locally. At that point, we brought his wife to Houston for a 2-day interview.
Authorities needed to know as much as they could about Resendez, his patterns, and the places he had stayed.
And did he write you all the time?
She provided us with a lot of information about Resendez and his habits over the last 2 or 3 years. She advised that he brought her jewelry, he brought her figurines, sometimes little angel figurines. He brought her a guitar. I knew that a lot of these items had been stolen from crime scenes, and it in fact turned out that these items were linked to the homicides.
She said Resendez had been in Mexico very recently, but she hadn't seen him in days.
How were you made aware of that?
She was cooperating because she feared he wasn't safe there. In Mexico, bounty hunters were after him. Resendez was running out of places to hide. On July 10th, 1999, investigators received a phone page from Albuquerque. It was the fugitive's sister.
Yes, I'm returning your call.
She needed to talk to authorities,
Okay, we're on our way.
according to Special Agent Mark Young.
There were relatives in Mexico that were being approached by law enforcement, by bounty hunters, by curiosity seekers.
Lopez, thank you for the page. Can you tell me
There
a
were
little bit about
people
what's
that
going on?
really didn't care how they got him across. You know, dead or alive, I want the reward money.
She said her brother had called her. She did not want him to be harmed.
Law enforcement told her that we could effect a safe surrender for him, and we would agree to treat him humanely and get him in custody to resolve this thing.
On July 12, 1999, Rafael Resendez agreed to turn himself in to a Texas Ranger at a small border crossing.
Hands on your head.
Respecting his sister's wishes, authorities agreed to let him walk across and to take him in with a minimal arrest team. One of the most vicious serial killers in the nation's history was taken into custody quietly and without incident. In follow-up interviews with Mark Young, Resendez would confess to a total of 13 murders, 4 of them not yet connected to him by authorities.
He could recall in incredible detail crimes that occurred several years before. After discussions with him, I would contact the jurisdictions that had primary control of the investigations that he was referring to. And we resolved 2 homicides in Florida, Marion County, Florida, 1 in Colton, California, and 1 homicide in Barrow County, Georgia. You tell me the train.
The question in everyone's mind was why. In the interviews, Resendez made the sickening claim that he killed to wipe out evil. Yet among his victims were a doctor, a preacher and his wife, a teacher, and elderly people.
Did you murder?
All upstanding citizens, well loved by their families.
Yes.
The search for Rafael Resendez took 8 months and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. In court, he attempted to use an insanity defense to explain his crimes. But in May of 2000, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. 4 days later, Rafael Resendez was sentenced to death.